When they called me this morning, Mr. Bashir called this morning about finding a substitute program, Jen just happened to be in my office, and it was fortuitous because she has just retired from the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and she has had a monumental career catching tax cheats, people that think they have figured out how to avoid paying income tax. And so she did such a good job at the Department of Justice, they actually asked her to write a book about it. And so I guess the manual, hope I didn't.
Oh, no, okay, I know what you're talking about.
Okay. The manual that they're using in Washington, D.C. actually is something Jen wrote. So she started as an assistant DA in Beaumont.
Yes, sir.
In 1890, no, a long time ago. But anyhow, worked her way up to Washington, and she's been there quite a while. Please welcome Jen Ihlo.
Well, thank you all for having me. As Buster said, this was a bit of a short notice, so I have jotted down some notes. I did have, I think, an incredibly interesting career. It was happenstance that I ended up working for the tax division, criminal enforcement section of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And when I say in Washington, I mean I was headquartered in Washington. But I traveled all over the country prosecuting folks who, at the time, we called tax protesters. They were folks who claimed that the income tax just did not apply to them at all. And therefore, they didn't need to file a tax return. They didn't need to, certainly they didn't need to pay taxes. Now, when I first started this job in 1919, Buster, 89, the way they communicated with each other was by word of mouth and phone trees. And so there were just small pockets in different areas of the country. They were in Texas, they were up in the Northwest, and they were in a couple other southern states, but they were smaller groups. Well, along comes the internet, and now they've got cell phones and social media and email, and they can create documents that purport, that say, this is what our program sells. If you'll buy our program, you will never have to pay income taxes again, and it's all legitimate. And there were people who honestly paid more for the program than if they'd just paid their taxes in the first place and saved themselves from going to jail. But as the internet expanded, so did the number of protesters. And before long, they were all over the country. And there was a greater need for the department working with the Internal Revenue Service to kind of, keep track, because we didn't want, we wanted people to know that this was not legitimate. We didn't want people falling for it, so to speak. Some of their ideology is that the federal government didn't have authority over them. The counties, they claimed, did. The Posse Comitatus law, which does not mean what they said it did, but they claimed that that meant only the county sheriff could tell them what to do. But, after a while, they even changed that and said, well, no, actually, there's just no law enforcement personnel we're going to listen to. And they claimed that the only people who were required to pay taxes were 14th Amendment citizens, in other words, descendants of slaves, citizens in the territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and those of us who worked for the federal government. So I had to pay taxes, but, of course, they didn't. I think really the best way to kind of illustrate for you some of these schemes and ideologies is with a couple of war stories. And I think then you'll also understand why I had such a great time in my 32 years of working for the Justice Department. The first one is an individual named Roger Minner, and he was a carpenter, lived in Richmond, Virginia, and his big thing was that the federal government just did not have any jurisdiction over him at all. And so we said, fine. We investigated our case, and we put our evidence together, and we went to the grand jury, and the grand jury said, yep, let's indict him, and we send our agents out to arrest him. We bring him in, and the court clerk calls the case, United States versus Minner. And he pounds on the podium and says, prove to me you have jurisdiction over me. Prove to me you have jurisdiction over me. And I'm thinking, son, we brought you in here in handcuffs. I think that ought to prove to you we have some jurisdiction over you. But he wasn't giving it up. So the judge said, take him to jail. And so for about 2 weeks, every couple of days, the judge would bring him in and he'd go through this whole charade again. And I quit coming to court because I wasn't even announcing present. So I'd have an AUSA sit in for me. And finally, the court clerk called and said, this Friday, we're going to have an arraignment one way or the other. I said, all right, I'll be there. So drove down to Richmond, and Mr. Minner does his jurisdiction thing, and the judge is trying to talk to him. And one thing you learn really quickly as a trial lawyer is you don't talk when the judge is talking, right? Because the judge can even put me in jail if he or she doesn't like how I'm behaving. So the judge is talking, and Minner's talking, and the judge is talking, and Minner's talking. And finally, the judge looks over at the marshals and said, Marshal, gag him. I'm like, oh, this was worth the gas to drive down here. I said, I'm not sure how this is going to play out. And the marshals are clearly not wanting to walk over there and put their hand over this guy's mouth. So they're kind of reluctant. And the third time the judge ordered them to gag him, one of the marshals pulled a handkerchief out and walked over to him, started to put his hand over his mouth, and he stopped talking. So the judge looked at me and said, who's here for the United States? And I stood up and said, good morning, Your Honor. And that set Mr. Minner off again. And the judge said, she only said good morning, shut up. But that was one of their tactics, was to just on and on and on declare that the government didn't have jurisdiction, thinking that somehow the judges were going to fall for it. Another guy, this was a fun one, well, your flag doesn't have any gold fringe on it. In the federal courthouses, the flags have gold fringe on them. And so the tax protesters got this idea that gold fringe on a flag meant that it was a maritime court. And so this one guy went into court in San Antonio and told the federal judge that he didn't have any jurisdiction over him because he was presiding over a maritime court, and Mr. Kearns, because of the flag, and Mr. Kearns had not been on a ship. And so they did this every day for about 2 weeks during the trial, and finally the judge had had enough, and he said, Mr. Kearns, I am beginning to see your point. I see a ship on the horizon, and it's yours, and it's sinking. So after that, Mr. Kearns decided not to come to court. He was eventually convicted in absentia and served a number of years in federal prison. Another one of my favorite ones is an individual I prosecuted in Oregon, and it was a group called the Christian Patriot Association. And they were running what they claimed was the U.S. equivalent of a Swiss bank account. And that if you sent your money to them, they wouldn't keep any records, they wouldn't ask for a Social Security number from you, and then you wouldn't have to, the government would never be able to figure out your money. Well, we knew they were keeping records because they would collect money, and then you could write, Danny Paul could write and say, well, send me, $10,000. I need, I'm going to go on vacation. I'm going to go on the squirrel-a-thon. I need some cash. And so they'd send it to him, and I'm thinking they're not going to send anybody any money if they don't know how much of their money they've got. So we did an investigation. It was massive. It was a $186 million tax fraud conspiracy, over 900 account holders nationwide. And we prosecuted 7 of them. We prosecuted the operators of the bank, and we prosecuted a couple of others who had other ties to the bank besides just users. And one of them was both a doctor and a lawyer, and named Dr. Kirkham. And I had, we divided them up. There were 3 prosecutors, and we divided them up, and Dr. Kirkham was one of my defendants. So his whole spiel was that he didn't have to pay taxes because he was white. Time out of mind. I'm like, time out of mind? Well, we finally figured out that that meant as far back in his genealogy as he could go, he was white. And then he didn't have to pay taxes. So he takes the stand and claimed that he had written to the IRS 65 times and they'd never written back to him. And I said, well, yeah, I know that. So I get up on cross and I said, well, now, Dr. Kirkham, you testified that the government, IRS, didn't write back to you and tell you that, in fact, you had to pay taxes. And he said, that's right. I said, well, let's look at a couple of those letters. I said, here's one. You wrote to the IRS and said you didn't have to pay taxes because you were white. Time out of mind. Did you sign that letter? Yes, I did. And the IRS never responded to tell you that you had to pay taxes because you were white? Well, that's right. Well, by now the jury's kind of figured it out. But then here's another one. I said, let's talk about this other letter. Here's one where you wrote to the IRS and said you didn't have to pay taxes because you were not Snow White. That Snow White was an Appalachian and you were not an Appalachian, and therefore you did not have to pay taxes. I said, did you really expect the IRS to respond to any of these letters? And he just sat there. But I'd made my point with the jury. My other favorite piece of Dr. Kirkham's cross was that he said, a lot of them didn't use Social Security numbers. They either wouldn't get one or they just wouldn't use it. But we had a whole bunch of false Social Security numbers that Dr. Kirkham had used. So I went through all the ones that Social Security put in and said, and you use this Social Security number, right? Yep. And this one, right? Yep. And this one. And so even knowing that you should never ask a question you don't know the answer to, I couldn't resist. I said, now, Dr. Kirkham, you just testified that you used these 9 false Social Security numbers. Is that right? That's right. Were there any other numbers you use that the government doesn't know about? And he said, oh, I'm sure there are. I just make them up when I need one. Wow. So I said, thank you very much. Sat down. He was convicted and served, 10 or so years in prison. The last war story I'll tell you is Dr. Claycomb, who...
Before you get off the Christian whatever...
the Christian Patriot Association. If you wanted to be, the best way to be a member of the Christian Patriot Association and hide your money from the government was that if you would make your business into a name that had the acronym Christian Patriot Association. So Cross, Price, Adams for a law firm, for example. I just made that up. But that would be CPA. And you'd have your employer write all the checks to CPA and then send it over to the Christian Patriot Association. And then they commingled the funds of all these folks into a single bank account. And we actually did figure out, I said earlier it was $186 million they were running through this account. We did figure out the code they were using for account holders. So we were able to figure out whose money was whose. The only folks we never figured out were the folks who, there was an account holder named Mickey Mouse, and there was a couple other those kinds of account holders, and we never did figure out who they were, but we got enough of them that we shut that bank down. So Dr. Claycomb, he was actually from Nacogdoches. He was a radiologist, and he had been prosecuted for failure to file tax return, that I didn't do that case, and then he served some time, and he got out, and he continued to not file or pay taxes, and then I end up working another case against him. And basically his stick was that he was smarter than everybody else in the world, and that he had figured out the loophole that not one other person in the U.S. had figured out that meant he didn't have to pay taxes. So that didn't go over well with the jury because he was actually quite arrogant. But he also, and Buster told Allison that when we left that his office, that I had promised to tell a dirty joke. So here you go. Dr. Claycomb had written to a buddy of his, and they were of like mind, and he's writing him, telling him, this is how we're going to fool the government, and this is how we're going to fool the government. And in those emails, some of them had some really foul language. The F word, for example, was used a lot. Well, we put some of those emails in. We didn't want to put all of them in, and we knew the judge wasn't going to let us put a lot of emails with foul language in it. So we put just kind of the key ones we needed to get into evidence. And Dr. Claycomb got on the stand, and his lawyer said, you know, government put this document into evidence. Now, it's got the F word in it. Do you normally talk like that? And Dr. Claycomb said, that's the only time I have ever used that word. And I looked at my agent and I said, pull all those other emails. He said, all of them? I said, every one of them. And I spent the next 30 minutes making him read them out loud to the jury. So that's my equivalent for you today of a dirty joke. Some of these folks were dangerous. After, you know, I laugh about kind of the war stories, and they were fun, but I prosecuted a case in Austin, and the militia, right after Oklahoma City, the militia were gathering nationwide to come and hang me and my trial partner. Credible evidence that the FBI had uncovered, and so we had to be, we spent more time leading up to trial making sure the jury was safe, the judge was safe, and we were safe than we did preparing for trial. And my boss called and said, you know, it's getting kind of serious down there. Maybe you should come home. And I said, you know what? If I leave, they win. So stuck it out. Obviously, I made it through. In another case, the CPA case, one of the defendants body slammed me across a table and was running at me from across the courtroom another time, intending to cold cock me. And I'm as hard-headed as my mother is. So I just stood there and thought he's probably only going to get to hit me once before a whole bunch of people jump on him. But a defense attorney got between us and kept him from hitting us. But that was the more serious side of prosecuting these folks. And, you know, by and large, they all went to jail. We'd put them in jail, and somebody'd come along and say, well, they didn't do it just exactly right, and then we'd go put those folks in jail. So bottom line, if somebody tries to sell you a package that says you too can avoid paying income taxes, I'm willing to bet it's a scam, and you should run as hard and fast as you can. And that's kind of what I got. Got any questions or?
Where do I send that letter to get that squirrel fund, buddy?
Yeah. Well, you know, he's probably out of prison by now, so.
He's playing your big mouth.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, sir.
Do you think that income tax is the fair way to tax people?
You know what? That's not my job. It never was my job. I'm a criminal prosecutor, not a tax.
It's something I'd like for you to think about.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Income tax is for the people that's got, you know, Social Security cards and things, accountants, that. To me, do away, abolish income tax totally and start charging extra taxes on sales. That would be the fair way to tax everybody, because there's so many people that doesn't have a Social Security card and won't pay taxes. If they buy anything, they pay taxes.
Yeah.
Duly noted.
That's the most progressive way to tax. Just to tax people that don't have much income, too much money.
Right.
Tax big cancer people. And I also say that we're getting into politics, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing.
No.
Yep, that's not my thing. Let me be clear, I'm a criminal prosecutor. I never even took tax law in law school.
Right.
So, yes, sir.
So I'm not sure ask Sammy this, but is this a group of these people are all individual. You said were they all connected somehow, or they just
Not
like
all
got
of
the
them.
idea and stuck with
Yeah,
it?
not all of them. There were different pockets of groups across the country, and then they would be connected nationwide once we had the internet. We'd work cases where I might have you're always having to figure out what's the best venue for a case, and so we'd look to see what the most facts were wherever we were. And I've had cases where I thought the venue was going to be in one case, and I got down there and looked at it and said, nah, really the venue is somewhere else, and then we just go there. But there might be like the account holders and the Christian Patriot Association. Those folks were all connected, but they were all over the country, and vast majority of them had never met each other, had never met the operators of the bank, which is another thing. I'm like, how on earth can you send your money
Just hand your money
to somebody you've never met and you don't know, and who says, I'm not going to keep any records?
Was that money just confiscated, or you go back? Where'd it go?
We seized a lot when we did the search warrant, and the operators came in and said, we didn't, this is a civil case, but the operators came in and said, it's not our money, it's the account holders, so you have to give it back, and so we can give it to the account holders. And the judge says, no, if the account holders want it, they can come in and prove to me that it's theirs, and they're not coming because they know I'm going to be sitting at the front door.
Yep.
And so last I heard, the government was still sitting on that money because we
So
didn't have
there you
anybody.
go. Send it your letter.
Didn't have anybody to give it to. You can,
They've already spent it, don't worry about it.
Yeah. No, I don't know. This stuff stays in escrow, and anyway, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, like kind of like sovereign citizenship.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah. We caught, when I first started doing this, they were called tax protesters. And then we changed administrations all the time, and I don't even remember if it was Democrat or Republican because it doesn't matter, but we got a new assistant attorney general. He said, well, I don't like protesters because, we can all protest. I said, yeah, this is different, but whatever. So we started calling them tax defiers, which I thought was kind of stupid, but I'm not running the show, so I said,
Anti-taxers.
okay. And then, but the reality is that across the spectrum, the ideology is sovereign citizen, but the tax protesters are a subset of that. I mean, theoretically, a sovereign citizen could be paying taxes, but if we looked at them, if the IRS investigated them and brought the case to us in the tax division, then we call them tax defiers or tax protesters. And then the book that Buster was talking about, I actually became the national expert for how to prosecute these cases because it was a bit of an art to it because they try all this nonsense. And a lot of judges, when somebody comes in claiming the court doesn't have jurisdiction over them, or a lot of judges thought they were nuts. And so they'd want a psychological evaluation. And I'm like, no. They are learning this. It's a learned behavior. It is not a psychological disorder. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of cases, we'd get the judge to not order a psychological evaluation because it was just a waste of government money. And most of the tax protesters, no, I'm not nuts. I don't want that. So, but I became the national expert for kind of the art of this, and I taught a lot, and so I created this, I called it a monogram, for lack of a better word, that was kind of like a how-to, and it was a brain drain. And I made sure it was all up to date before I retired 4 years ago, because I didn't know, if they were going to appoint somebody in my place or whatever, and so I just did the best I could with a brain drain of what the issues were and what the case law was at that time. And the National Advocacy Center houses it on their website. I think it's not public, obviously. Yes, sir.
Did anybody,
How long ago did the government start with income taxes? I believe that before the whole 1300s, there was no income taxes.
1916 was when the income tax amendment was passed.
So
I think 1913 or 19.
things to with if the enough revenue comes in we can abolish income taxes again.
I'm not going there.
No, she's a prosecutor.
I'm not going there. Not in my job description.
Quit spending. It's on the stuff operators use, those funds from their personal use or.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And we'd use that again. I mean, Dr. Claycomb, for example, you know, he wasn't paying taxes, and we put into evidence that he bought this Jagunda house in Houston and put in a swimming pool and, you know, what all the money he was spending on himself while not paying income taxes. The ones the juries really, really hated were the folks who were claiming money from the government, like disability, and then coming in, but then not paying taxes, and the jury's like, no. Danny
Now, did anybody ever follow up on these people after they were sentenced and spent time in jail? Once they got out, did they decide that they could go ahead and pay taxes?
Well, so what
I don't know
happened?
if you follow up like that.
Yeah, so what happens is, once I've prosecuted them and they've gone to jail, then we will get the court to order restitution. But that's a very limited amount of what taxes they actually owe.
Right.
So once I've prosecuted them and they're out of jail, civil folks in the IRS get them. And then they go after the money and they track them. And sometimes what happens is they will lie to their probation officer, for example, or they will lie to the IRS, and then they come back and we'll prosecute them again, or we'll do a motion to revoke probation and put them back in jail. I had several that I did, they went back to jail more than once. Yes, sir.
During your career, what do you think the total number at one time, how many tax protesters would you say there were?
Well, I really have no idea.
Don't know if it's thousands or millions or.
No, I mean, I've had that question asked before, and there's no way to know because, you know, they used false Social Security numbers, alias names. They were loosely affiliated groups, so there really was no way to quantify them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
On the individual, you might have said this, and I missed it, but on the individual basis, all those folks, like Dr. Clayton, did the IRS like audit them, and then they figured out, hey, you've made X amount, and you've already paid that? How did they figure it out? Like, where was the
Some of
red flag
them,
coming?
and I'd have to think. With Clayton, I'm not sure. But sometimes they would come to us because there would be civil action, and this may be what happened with Clayton. There would be a civil case where they're trying to, you know, they know he hasn't filed, but they've got, you know, he's a radiologist, so the hospital where he works are sending W-2s into the IRS, and the IRS says, oh, well, there's no tax return to match this, so IRS opens a civil investigation, or I don't think they call it investigation, but whatever. They conduct their investigation, and I end up getting them 9 times out of 10 because they lied.
Oh, wow.
They hid their money.
Jeez.
You know, the stuff that makes it criminal. You know, I don't prosecute anybody for just not paying their income tax. I have to have willfulness, and I have to prove the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12, unanimous decision. So, you know, we're careful about what cases we take to make sure we can prove them. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
You know, you're talking about the gentleman just randomly making that number or whatever. Okay, if you're doing that enough times, you're bound to probably hit up on an actual number.
Oh, he hit on a lot of actual numbers.
Something.
And we put the Social Security, we put a Social Security person on the stand. They can't tell us whose number it was, but they could tell us, for example, that this was a number that was owned by somebody who, if they were still alive, would have been 112 years old and was black or a female or, you know, whatever demographics, they could testify about that, which is great evidence to show that it was certainly not his number and it wasn't a mistake. And then with the number of Social Security numbers we had, we could show the jury this is no mistake that he used these numbers. Yes, sir?
These are statute of limitations on the taxes, is it 7 years?
Well, so civilly Yeah.
10 years ago.
Civilly, I'm not 100% certain. Criminally, most cases are the statute is 6 years. But for misdemeanors, they might be 3, but it just depends on the facts of the misdemeanor. But by and large, for tax crimes, it's 6 years. For almost all other crimes, it's 5 years. But we get the extra year because these are paper-intensive cases. And back when I first started, we'd subpoena a bank. It would take months to get the records, and they would be prints from microfiche, and sometimes really hard to read. And then our agents had to go in and create our spreadsheets. So that's one of the reasons I think Congress gave us that extra time.
I don't mean this to be political, but is the department healthy? Is your old department?
I'm not
The
gonna
DOJ, or
I'm
have
not-
they been,
I'm not going to answer that.
you just did.
Okay. You don't know what the answer is to the read.
Thank you.
Sure. You can tell I love my job.
Oh, yes. It's awesome. What sport is? That's what we had.
And you and Jen have something in common.
Oh, yeah. Funny. What is that?
You're a brand-new citizen of the United States.
You missed too.
Oh, we have another one? Oh, no, Jen has always been a citizen of the United States.
Yes.
But her- Her news is,
I choose.
I'm not a brand new citizen of Germany, but I have had confirmed that I'm a citizen of Germany since birth.
Congratulations.
Ja, ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch und du?
but her grandfather was German. Clay's
And
Great-grandfather.
great-grandfather. Yeah.
tiny bit of Germany's not a whole lot. I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Hey,
Wow,
Don't get your hand too far out.
they're good, they're good, yeah.
There's no other business?
thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was fun.
Thank you.